They thought tearing down my barn would break me, they had no idea it would drain their $1 million lake instead. What happened next exposed secrets the HOA buried for years, turned neighbors into enemies, and forced a resort board to beg the man they tried to ruin. If you love explosive revenge stories with shocking twists and satisfying justice, hit subscribe and don't miss what really happened the day I shut the damn valve. The morning I found my barn reduced to splinters, I knew the Homeowners Association had finally crossed from petty harassment into open war, but even I didn't realize how far they'd gone until I saw the yellow demolition notice flapping from a broken post like a victory flag planted by invaders, and standing there in the dust with the smell of fresh-cut pine and diesel still hanging in the air, I felt something inside me settle into a cold, deliberate calm that scared me more than anger ever could, because anger burns fast but calm revenge waits. My family's barn had stood on that patch of land for nearly 40 years, built by my father with timber he milled himself, reinforced with steel beams after a storm in '98, expanded when I took over the property and turned half of it into a small woodworking shop, and for 3 years the HOA had been circling it like vultures, claiming it violated the aesthetic harmony guidelines of the luxury resort development that had sprouted like a fungus on the other side of the ridge, a development complete with manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, and a man-made lake fed by the old agricultural dam that bordered my land. They sent violation letters about the paint color, about the roof angle, about agricultural odors, and I responded with permits, surveys, and county approvals every single time, but what I didn't know was that behind closed doors the board had been negotiating a private expansion deal with the resort investors, and my barn, which sat inconveniently close to the dam access road, was in the way of their future spa complex. They claimed an emergency safety inspection required immediate demolition due to structural instability, yet no inspector had ever stepped onto my property with my permission, and the only warning I got was a voicemail left at 6:12 a.m. saying they were exercising their authority under Section 14C of the bylaws, which I later discovered didn't even apply to properties outside the gated subdivision. By the time I drove back from a supply run that afternoon, the structure was gone, my tools were buried under debris, and a private security truck idled at the edge of my driveway as if daring me to object. I did object, loudly, and the guard shrugged, telling me to take it up with the board, and that was when I noticed something else. The gravel road leading to the dam's secondary valve gate had been freshly graded, and heavy equipment tracks ran straight from the resort side across the boundary line they'd always insisted was sacred. I spent that night going through paperwork, digging up old county maps my father kept rolled in a metal tube, and what I found changed everything. The original water rights agreement from 1978 granted my family shared operational access to the dam infrastructure because our land had once provided the runoff channel that fed the reservoir, a clause inserted after a drought nearly bankrupted the previous owner, and though the HOA had since built luxury homes and branded the lake as a private amenity, the underlying easement had never been extinguished. The next morning I drove to the county clerk's office and confirmed it. My access rights were intact, and more importantly, the emergency overflow valve on the north side of the dam sat on a sliver of land still deeded to me. When I confronted the HOA president, a woman named Claire who spoke in polished legal phrases and condescending smiles, she told me I was mistaken and that any interference with community water assets would be met with litigation, but I saw something flicker in her eyes when I mentioned the easement number. That afternoon I walked the fence line and found a new chain and padlock on the access gate, which was amusing because the hinge post stood squarely on my parcel, and cutting that chain felt less like trespassing and more like reclaiming stolen ground. I didn't shut the dam valve immediately, contrary to what people later claimed. I wasn't reckless. Instead, I documented everything, filmed the demolished barn, cataloged the debris, and hired a surveyor who confirmed the boundary markers had been shifted 6 feet in the resort's favor. The surveyor also told me quietly that the HOA had applied for a rapid expansion permit contingent on removal of adjacent obsolete agricultural structures, language that described my barn as if it were already gone. The final straw came 3 days later when a glossy brochure for the Lakeside Serenity Spa appeared in my mailbox, featuring an artist's rendering of infinity pools precisely where my barn once stood, the caption reading, "Opening soon, elevated tranquility," and that was when I decided tranquility was about to become very expensive. I chose the hottest Saturday of the summer season, when the resort was fully booked and paddleboats dotted the lake like confetti, and just before noon I walked to the valve housing with a wrench my father had used for decades, unscrewed the protective casing, and slowly turned the emergency release mechanism a calibrated quarter rotation, enough to begin lowering water levels gradually, not enough to cause structural stress, because I wasn't interested in destruction, I was interested in leverage. Within hours the shoreline receded visibly, exposing muddy banks and stranded decorative rocks the resort had carefully arranged, and by sunset guests were posting confused photos of the shrinking lake. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting and sent out an email blaming unexpected evaporation, which would have been funny if it weren't so arrogant, but by the next morning docks sat tilted at awkward angles and the fountain in the center sputtered dry. Claire arrived at my gate with 2 board members and a lawyer, demanding I restore water levels immediately, and I calmly presented copies of the easement, the survey report, and photographs of the demolished barn, explaining that until we reached a settlement covering reconstruction costs, lost equipment, and punitive damages for unlawful demolition, the valve would remain partially open. They threatened injunctions, police involvement, and criminal charges, but the county sheriff, after reviewing the documents I'd already filed, told them it was a civil matter and that access to the valve on my land was within my rights. What they didn't expect was the investors' reaction. The resort's parent company sent a representative who bypassed the HOA entirely and knocked on my door that evening, offering to explore amicable resolution, which translated to money. Negotiations dragged for 2 tense days while the lake dropped another foot, revealing a rusted shopping cart and a submerged sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing," ironic considering their own boundary games. Then the first twist surfaced when a local reporter called asking for comment on allegations that the HOA had forged an inspection certificate to justify the demolition, and I realized someone inside the board had leaked documents. It turned out the treasurer, tired of being sidelined in expansion talks, had copied internal emails showing Claire knew the barn was structurally sound and had approved demolition to accelerate investor timelines. Public outrage shifted overnight, and residents who once complained about my eyesore barn began questioning why their lake access fees were funding legal cover-ups. Still, I didn't fully close the valve or escalate. I kept the flow steady, enough to maintain pressure without risking fish kills or ecological damage, because I wanted moral high ground. The second twist came when my insurance company, initially reluctant to cover anything due to third-party action, discovered that the demolition crew lacked proper authorization signatures, voiding the HOA's liability shield, and suddenly there was real money on the table. Claire attempted one final maneuver by filing a restraining order claiming I endangered public safety, but during the hearing my attorney produced drone footage showing heavy machinery crossing onto my land days before the supposed emergency, and the judge denied the order while suggesting mediation. Mediation lasted 12 hours in a windowless conference room where the resort's investors stared at spreadsheets projecting millions in losses if the lake remained partially drained through peak season, and I watched Claire's confidence erode as her own board members realized she'd gambled community assets on a private deal. By midnight an agreement was drafted. Full reconstruction of my barn to upgraded specifications at their expense, replacement of all tools and materials, a formal written apology circulated to every resident, reimbursement of legal fees, and a permanent recorded acknowledgement of my water access rights with a maintenance stipend. Only after the ink dried did I walk back to the dam at dawn and slowly return the valve to its original position, listening as water pressure equalized and the reservoir began to reclaim its edges. Over the next week the lake refilled, docks straightened, and the spa brochures quietly disappeared, but the final twist came a month later when Claire resigned under investigation for fiduciary misconduct, and several board seats flipped in a special election where transparency became the new campaign slogan. My rebuilt barn rose stronger than before, with steel siding and a roof designed to outlast any aesthetic complaint, and I added a small plaque near the door that read, "Established 1984, rebuilt 2026, not as a trophy but as a reminder that land, like water, remembers who respects it." People sometimes ask if I regret shutting the valve, and I tell them I didn't shut the dam to destroy a lake. I opened it just enough to let truth surface, because when powerful neighbors assume you'll fold under pressure, sometimes the only language they understand is leverage measured in inches of receding shoreline. In the end the resort still stands, the lake still sparkles under summer sun, and my barn casts a longer shadow than it ever did before, not because it's bigger but because everyone who sees it knows that behind those walls is someone who refused to be quietly erased. And if you ever find yourself staring at rubble where your hard work once stood, remember this story and ask yourself what valve in your life you've been too afraid to turn, because sometimes justice doesn't roar, it flows steadily, deliberately, and impossible to ignore.